So what I was going to show you is some... I've got longer to talk about it than I thought I would, which is good. So I want to talk about who I am, introduce what FWUPD and LVFS is. I want to talk about the problem, which I think is fairly obvious. I'm going to talk about what already exists, talk about what customers want, and what hardware vendors have to do. And I'm going to talk and have some key takeaways that vendors will need to do, and have some time for questions. So I've been building open source software for about 20 years, 17 of those years at Red Hat. I've been obsessing about firmware updates for about 7 or 8 years now. And I mean this, like when I was asked to speak, I was like, I can talk about this for 4 or 5 hours, it's fine. I work now with about it depends how you define hardware vendor, but about 140 different hardware vendors on the LVFS and FWUPD projects. Probably most of you in the room have had teams that have worked with this project. That includes OEMs, increasingly ODMs, silicon vendors, BIOS vendors, independent hardware vendors, which there are more and more of now, and kind of every layer of the supply chain. So although this stuff comes across as like OEM A and user B, actually it encompasses the entire supply chain. So when I talk about Lenovo firmware updates, we're talking about like NVMe disks by Micron in Lenovo hardware built by the ODM, and every layer of the supply chain. So let's start off. What is LVFS? LVFS is essentially a glorified website. It's currently at fwupd.org, and it's where normal users don't use this. This is where, if you're an ODM, Wistron, Foxconn, or OEM, Lenovo, Dell, HPE, whoever, would upload firmware to. It then takes all those firmware archives, which incidentally the same format as you would use in Microsoft Update, and takes that and generates metadata. And that generates the metadata every day and distributes it across the entire world. And it's downloaded hundreds of millions of times a day. So since we've started, we've distributed 120 million downloads, which I'm incredibly proud of, and it's increasing day on day. And we support about 1,800 different devices. That's how many devices there are publicly available. There's a lot more devices that are still being tested or will come out this year, next year, whatever. But the sad state of affairs is it's mostly laptops. It's some desktops and quite a few peripherals. Actually, for servers, it's a bit of a sad story. So what's the other side of this? We have this beautiful metadata information from a website. And we have all the firmware blobs on this website. But unless we have a way of actually squirting it onto the hardware, it's useless. So this is FWUPD. And you can pronounce it however you like. FWUPD, I don't really mind. When I troll vendors, if I want to really troll them, I say it's like the sound jelly makes when it falls off a plate. There's 90 different protocols supported, which sounds a lot. And then you think, well, how many different ways of putting stuff on an SPI chip are there? And trust me, a lot. So there's everything from Redfish, we're going to talk about quite a lot, for server vendors, NVMe, ATA, USB, DFU, and there's about maybe 50 or so vendor proprietary protocols. Wacom USB, Wacom RAW, Logitech Hit++, Logitech Bulk Controller. And a part of this journey has been going to the vendor and saying, hey, if you open source your protocol, which will cost you nothing, there's no interesting IP there. If you open source the protocol and we add it to FWUPD, then users can use this. Right? Lots of green flags going up, right? And it's more profound than that. So if you go to someone like Synaptics and say, hey, can you open source your Synaptics MST firmware update protocol? Dell can use that. Lenovo can use that. HP can use that. And so you have someone who comes to the LVFS and FWUPD projects and say, hey, I want to support this Dell dock. And you're like, oh, actually, we've written all the code already. We just need some vids and PIDs, and it should magically work. And the ODM just doesn't understand that they don't have to do any work, and it magically just works. And it's amazing. But it also means we can share all this code. So like 2 examples here. One was a server, an NVMe drive vendor who said to the US government, hey, I know you've got some data corruption issue that is fixed by a firmware update. You can fix this using a firmware update program. And the US Gov said, no, we can't run that because we haven't audited it. It won't run in our secure environment. And so the US Gov solution was replace all of the NVMe drives with a different vendor, which is insane. The other thing is, like, a lot of the firmware update binaries that are provided are statically linked x64 blobs, like, I don't know, 60 megabytes in size. But when you're Chrome OS and you have hundreds of millions of machines all running ARM64, and your SSD vendor says, hey, yeah, here's an update, which is a statically linked 64 meg binary on your 2 gigabyte MMC device, which doesn't even run with the right architecture. It's totally unsuitable. And so Google took a quarter of their eMMC storage was firmware updaters, and with FWUPD, that's turned to 35K. So it's literally made everything so much smaller because all the vendors can just share the NVMe update code or the ATA update code. So the takeaway here is that most vendors don't need to do anything. So let's think, what is firmware? Firmware is software. Firmware, the way I define software is, firmware is software that's really hard to deploy, right? So what most, like the mid-tier sort of scalers here, like, they're not using the tools that the vendors are providing. They're not using the latest tools from HPE. They're not using the latest think stuff from Lenovo. They're taking the tools, and essentially they're reverse engineering them and then putting them into their own tools so that they can work with their existing environment. So we've got Scaleway saying, like, IPMI is a nightmare. The Criteo is saying, we can't, like, they're impossible tasks. The stuff that the vendor's giving us is terrible. The tools are usually, like, generation specific as well. So going from one ILO to a different ILO, the tools all change. Well, that's not what they want. No customer in this room is running just HPE or just Dell or just Lenovo. And having a solution that only works with one vendor doesn't work in the workflow that they've got. Now, lots of green fingers, that's great. Lots of vendors have tried the LVFS. Some have done, I can't name names because this is all secret until it becomes public. Some have done end-to-end tests and it all works. Some others have done end-to-end tests and decided that actually they do want a subscription on their firmware updates for security reasons. So I'm basically here to try and convince that what we've got now could work. Like, we've tested this on ThinkSystem, Gen 10, Gen 11, Dell, Supermicro, Avantec, OpenBMC. All of these BMC implementations are quirky as hell, but we can work around them in one place. We can use things like Dell has this nice ephemeral user and password, so we don't need to kind of provision a user agent over IPMI. But if we do have to do that, we can use the SNBIOS Type 42 table to say, okay, which is the internal network card for the BMC, connect to it, provision a user account using IPMI, and then connect to it via Redfish. And then you can do all of your connection with the BMC using FWUPD. What we also support is BKCs, which is a best-known configuration. So it could be the server vendor, let's say Lenovo ThinkSystem, whatever. Says, okay, for this workload, we recommend this BMC version, this EC version, this CPLD version, and this RAID version. Now, that's great. We support that. We can say, you set the BKC for the device on the host, and we sync all the firmware settings, and it magically happens over Redfish. We don't always want that, and I'll come to that later. What do we also get when we use the LVFS is if you actually include the SBOM, the software bill of materials information, into the blob itself, we can extract it. And so when you have a customer like, I don't know, Swiss government says, actually we need a SBOM in SPDX format for CRA compliance, rather than saying, well, hang on, we need to generate that manually, you can just upload the firmware to the LVFS with the correct blobs, and it magically creates all these formats. Now, lots of people, like, the CRA is a big deal, and the executive order from the US is a big deal. And a lot of the firmware vendors have kind of buried their heads in the sand and said, okay, we can get some intern to run some report script. And as soon as you do any firmware updates, that report is completely invalid. And this is something that I think is more and more important. This is going to be a case where you can't sell to certain customers unless you have an SBOM. And a lot of the firmware vendors just don't have a plan on how to do this. So let's talk about what customers actually want. Now, I've got a belief here that a lot of the customers buying the servers feel like they're not being listened by the server vendors. So a reassuringly high number of green ticks. Now, just to put this in perspective, like in this room, the purchasing power of all of the companies in this room is about 200 million euros per year. And if you work it out over the last 10 years, the people in this room, the companies, have spent nearly €1 billion in the last 10 years. And they're not being listened to. Like, that's, I don't get it, I really don't. Like again, lots of green hands again. So a lot of server vendors will provide a AI-enhanced tool which can do firmware updates for their hardware. And that's not really what the customers are after. They want to be able to mirror all the firmware updates. So a good example here is, let's say a well-known animation studio in the US. They had a solution where every machine was needing to have internet access to do firmware updates. That's nonsense. So they now use FWUPD and LVFS to download all the updates for the entire, they basically mirror the entire LVFS to some internal NFS share and point all of their servers at that NFS share and say, get firmware updates from there. That makes way more sense to them. The other problem we have is that BKCs are a good way of grouping together, say, okay, well, this RAID card, this system firmware. But sometimes the customers don't want to do that. Sometimes there's a regression in, say, the RAID firmware. So they want to use the latest SM BIOS to get the firmware, sorry, the latest system firmware to get the security updates, but they don't want to use the new RAID firmware because there's a bug. And some of these vendor tools just don't let you break the rules like that. Also, similarly, we might want to say, again, lots of green thumbs because vendors, the customers know what they want, and the vendors are like, no, we want you to do it differently. And it's super frustrating. So a good example here is, can we roll out the updates to, say, 20% of the fleet on day 1, 50% on day 2, and the rest on day 3? And the vendor tools just don't let you do that. It's all very manual and all very kind of putting servers into groups, and it's just, you can't automate it like you would any other software developer platform. Now, the biggie is update descriptions. It's literally the single biggest thing that people complain about. It's when you have a vendor, there's two things they will do. Wow, so many green thumbs, right? So there's two ways that this can be messed up. You'll get a vendor that says, updated code drop 2025. Is that important? The other way they'll do is that they'll go the other way and they'll say, this fixes a GPIO assert when using some NVMe very low level thing. And you sort of read it and you're like, I don't understand any of that. So what we're desperate to do is have understandable, by people like us, release notes with CVEs. Wow, lots of green thumbs. Now, vendors, like, we know what's in your firmware. Like, even when, like, so, good example, Lenovo ThinkSystem. The firmware is essentially an archive in an archive, in an archive, in an archive, in an archive. So we take all that apart on the LVFS, and we actually analyze the binaries themselves. So we know what microcode is in that archive of archive of archive of archive. We know, we can do static analysis on those tools to say, okay, well, we know this is still like susceptible to Spectre Meltdown, or we know that this has the old DBX in it, for instance. So we do all the analysis already. And so actually just being honest and saying, look, this update fixes this CVE or this DSA or however the internal token is, makes it so much easier for your customers. They know, is this an enhancement update that we can do at the next downtime window? Or is this something that we should start turning off servers, applying, and then turning them back on as soon as possible, like a world-ending security update? So like I said before, no customer is just a single supplier. No customer just gets their stuff from HPE. No customer gets their stuff just from Lenovo. Now, how many of these big suppliers are changing their Redfish interface or their IPMI interface between generations, going from, say, for example, Gen 10 to Gen 10 Plus, for example? Now, if we ask for one tool that can do many different generations, the vendor will say, no, that's the old tool's only supported with the old hardware, and the new tool's the only thing supported with the new hardware. And you say, okay, well, I found a bug in the new tool, and they're like, okay, well, we can get to that like Q1 2026. But you have that problem now. That's literally stopping you deploying servers now. So the takeaway from this is that the value add from having a vendor-specific tool isn't a value add, because your customers are taking the code, literally doing like wire dump traces, and then reverse engineering it and putting it into whatever they're using for deployment right now. Again, so many green thumbs. And it's just like, from someone who isn't involved in the purchasing side of this at all, for like $1 billion worth of like hardware for the customer to say to the supplier, I need X, and the supplier to say, nah, that doesn't make any sense to me. So here's a good question, here's a thumbs question. Who would prefer to buy hardware with FWUPD and LVFS support? Now, all of the vendors in that room, keep your little flags up. All the vendors in this room look around and say, okay, well, is it worth it? Now, I would suggest actually it possibly is. So what's the catch? Right, what's the cost? Right? LVFS is free. It's literally a free. The website is supported by the Linux Foundation, and there is no cost to upload or download firmware. So that means that any engineer, any project manager, anyone can try this stuff. And by default, everything is secret. So we've had vendors come to us and say, look, we don't know if this is going to work for us. Can we have a vendor account that only stays private, that no one knows about yet? Yeah, sure. Most vendors do that. Even the laptop vendors will come to us and say, can we test this before we announce it? So then what do you need to do? Okay, wow, this thing works. We've uploaded some firmware and our hardware seems to be detected correctly. What do we do now? So now install Linux, any Linux. I work at Red Hat, but I don't, like, preferably Fedora or RHEL, but like I don't care. Like FWUPD works on everything. It's literally Fedora, RHEL, Ubuntu, Chrome OS, soon to be Android. So install Linux on the host and test. Test, does the auto-provisioning work? Is FWUPD able to create its own user account with Redfish, either through IPMI or using the ephemeral connection? Check that your version is what you think. So it could be that the Redfish version is 12.23 or 12.34, and you actually do want what's called a quad format rather than a pair format. And in some cases, we might need to add some special passing. So a good example is a Lenovo Think system, where an odd number at the end would be this is like a unsigned development version. If it's an even number at the end, then it's a signed production version. So we just added 8 lines of code to support that use case. And then all of the firmware that has the DMI Lenovo using Redfish picks up those rules. Other things like sometimes there's backup versions. If there's AB firmware for your system firmware, we want to hide the backup partition, because although it's maybe useful to some people, in the majority of cases, if you're saying what firmware is on my server, you want to know the current version rather than the backup version. And the way you do this kind of tweaking is with a quirk. So a quirk is something you would submit upstream and say, for this version, gen whatever, treat these versions rather than as pairs, as quads. Then test deploying firmware. Does deploying actually work? So many vendors are like, yep, we've tested uploading and we've tested enumeration. Like, does updating work? And they're like, we haven't tried that bit. It's like, you need to try that bit. And it kind of enforced on the LVFS. When you download the firmware, you then get asked to do an anonymous report. And so if you're a vendor like Lenovo, Dell, HP, whoever, you would sign that report and say, this has been tested by Lenovo on this hardware, on this distro, on this day. And this kind of works in scale. So if the vendor accidentally does push out a bad update that starts being deployed, failing deployment, we automatically get that from end users. So if a user sends out like a bad NVMe update and it doesn't change the firmware version on the user's PC, we get back a deployment failure. If we go below 99% deployment success, we kill the update because this is firmware. It's scary. If it goes wrong, people get really upset. Excellent, that works. And again, to release notes, we need CVE details. We need to know how important an update is. If we get an NVMe update, is this fixing like data loss? Is this a performance increase? We need to know. We need to know so we know when to schedule the update. Wow, so many green ticks. So this stuff costs almost nothing. Testing is obviously QA time. Writing good release notes. Now, we do support writing release notes in different languages as well. So if you have a localization team to say, okay, we can supply this in English, French, Mandarin Chinese, that's brilliant because only 25% of the people using this can speak English. So at the moment, the bad vendor update notes, which are usually only available in one language, isn't suitable for 75% of your customers. So you need to sanity check what I'm saying. I'm being really hard on the hardware vendors because almost universally from the server point of view, it's pretty terrible. You need to sanity check all the things I'm saying. You need to go and ask your customers, hey, do you know what LVFS is? Wow, lots of green ticks as well. Second of all, would you like it if we supported LVFS? Because obviously there's meetings that need to be had. There's some cost in terms of testing and QA and that kind of thing. But I think if you ask your customers, it's not a case of asking your customers whether they want LVFS. I think the answer you'll get back is, oh, wow, thanks for listening to us, rather than, we don't know what LVFS is either. But I think sanity check what I say. You don't have to believe me. Also, the hardest bit is probably make sure that your firmware can be uploaded to the LVFS. So customers, the big customers, don't all download the firmware again and again and again and again. They just mirror the entire thing. So then they have a local mirror. Now, that doesn't play very well when you need a subscription in place. First of all, personally, if you have a subscription requirement for security updates, I think that's crazy because you've bought the hardware and you should, thank you, again, lots of green ticks. So if you can basically make the fact that you have security updates freely mirrorable on a private network on the LVFS, that's a marketing point. Make that available to your existing customers. Again, loads of green ticks. So this is something that is not, it's very low cost and very low risk that other vendors have done already. We've deployed 140 million downloads right now. So this is low risk, this is a well-tested solution. And make it public on the LVFS. The frustration I have is that so many server vendors in this room have tried this and then stumbled at the last make it public stage. It shouldn't be we've shown that it can be done theoretically or technically it's fine, but we haven't really got management buy-in. This needs to get over the finishing line. And I honestly think that the first vendor that does get this over the finishing line has the competitive advantage for the next tranche of hardware. Like, seriously, guys, look around. So, last few takeaways. The hardware vendors are providing stuff that the customers don't want to use. LVFS is safe, free, and well understood. It probably already works. You don't need to write any code. You might need to tweak some things, but it mostly already works. If you provide updates for LVFS and FWUPD, there is your commercial advantage. There is your USP. Look around, look at the green ticks, look at your customers who want this stuff. And I guess finally, slightly worryingly, is if this sounds interesting, email me. I'm happy to talk. Like I work with Red Hat, I have complete freedom to talk to 140 different vendors. This is something I do, this is my day job now. Any of your concerns like legal concerns, I can talk to your legal team. Any of your management concerns, I can talk to them about lost subscription revenue. But the conversation has to start. So thank you all for listening. I'm sorry for being hard on everyone. And now we have a few minutes for questions, I think. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. We also had production issues with updates of the firmwares because when we use the standard tools provided by the providers, there is the update within the OS, and then you have to reboot the machine to wait to have it. And one of the BMC updates did some SCSI updates every 100 and 300 seconds, and it froze completely for from 1 to 8 seconds, all IOs on the machine. So it was really difficult to understand this and to pinpoint that. And during all these times, the business was really pissed because they were really turning off. So if we have one standard tools to say, okay, during this update, the firmware version has changed from that to that, it would have saved us a lot of pain and also for the business.
And time. Like, so many of the vendor tools are so slow. Like, updating an NVMe drive with, like, a, 4 megabyte firmware, it takes 3 minutes. How? Like, how?
Yeah.
You imagine 3 minutes times 1,000 servers, and you can manage to reduce, like, the FWUPD NVMe plugin is... Now you think that times 1,000 servers.
For the update. And also the change log you said, it was, when we saw that and that issue and pinpointed, we asked the vendor, in the next release they said, okay, it's fixed, we checked, it was not fixed. And then it was yet another update. So
actually that's a good example of where we use the static analysis to show vendors where they might have done the wrong thing. So a good example here is microcode. So they might have a security team which has done a new firmware release, which is updates the microcode. And then they have like a product enhancement team that then 6 months later does an update which downgrades the microcode. So we've had that, I think, with 2 different vendors 7 times. And every single time the LVFS will literally prevent you doing that. It'll prevent you issuing a new update that does a microcode downgrade unless you waive it and override it. So there's all this stuff that we can provide kind of like for free, like the SBOM, like the microcode downgrade. The biggest thing is so dumb, right? We had a simple UTF-8, UTF-16 LEBE test for the words do not ship, do not trust. And 13% of all the firmware on the LVFS failed. Now that showed a industry-wide issue, which meant that one of the ODMs was shipping the Intel test certificate for one of their driver updates, which had a known private key. And it was a 36-month industry-wide CVE with 36-month disclosure found by looking for the words do not trust. So we do all of that stuff. Anyone else for questions?
So we are pretty lucky to get Richard with us during these 2 days. So I encourage you, all of you, to discuss with Richard during the lunch, during the pauses. We will have many pauses. Take time to speak with him. That will be useful for all of us. And thank you, and we'll continue with Jean Delvar on DMI Decode. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.